The stage was set. The lights burned bright in the Fox News studio, where U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance sat across from a panel of liberal journalists, his expression composed yet intense. The topic? Illegal immigration, a subject that had set the country ablaze with controversy. Vance knew what was coming. He had faced this before. The smug half-smiles, the carefully constructed gotcha questions, the relentless attempts to paint him as heartless. But tonight, he wasn't just here to debate. He was here to dismantle their arguments, brick by brick. The host, a young woman with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, leaned forward. Mr. Vice President, let's get straight to it. Your administration's stance on illegal immigration has been called draconian, even cruel. Just last week, a video of Border Patrol agents detaining a crying mother and her 2 children went viral. Does that image not shake you, sir? Do you not see the human cost of your policies? Vance tilted his head slightly. It was an old trick. Let them feel like they'd won the first strike, then counterpunch so hard they never saw it coming. I appreciate the question, he said, his voice even. And I do see the human cost. But you're showing only one side of the equation. Let me ask you this. Did that viral video also mention that the woman in question had been previously deported for drug trafficking? That she was caught smuggling fentanyl across the border just 2 years ago? The journalist blinked. A flicker of hesitation. Vance continued. We can't cherry-pick the most emotional images and ignore the reality. For every heartbreaking story of a migrant, there's another story you refuse to tell. The father who lost his daughter to fentanyl overdoses, the ranchers whose land is overrun by cartel foot soldiers, the working-class Americans who see their wages driven down because businesses exploit illegal labor. Do their struggles not matter? The second journalist, an older man with graying hair and an Ivy League confidence, leaned in. Mr. Vice President, let's talk about solutions, then. If you acknowledge the desperation that drives migrants to cross illegally, what do you propose? A wall? Militarized zones? Deportation on an industrial scale? Vance let a smile play at the corner of his mouth. The trap was obvious. They wanted him to sound extreme, to turn off the moderate voters watching at home. America is a nation of laws, he said, voice steady. And laws mean nothing if they're not enforced. Yes, we need border security. Yes, we need to end the magnet policies that incentivize illegal crossings. And yes, those who break our laws should be deported. But we also need to hold those in power accountable. Sanctuary cities refuse to cooperate with ICE. Congress refuses to close asylum loopholes. Meanwhile, the American people suffer. Why aren't you asking why? The first journalist recovered quickly. So, you think mass deportations are the solution? You think tearing families apart is holding people accountable? Vance's smile faded. His tone sharpened. No, I think securing our borders is a basic function of government, he shot back. And let's talk about families being torn apart. You act as if this is some cruel Republican policy. But who really separates families? It's the cartels who force parents to send their children on a 1,000-mile death march. It's the criminals who abuse Biden's policies to disappear into the country. And it's your side of the aisle who refuse to fix the laws and instead feed this crisis. The studio went silent for a second. The journalists were exchanging glances, recalibrating. Vance felt the tide shifting. And he was only getting started. The moment of hesitation from the journalists was brief, but Vance caught it. He knew the game: interrupt, reframe, attack. They needed to regain control before his argument took root in the minds of the millions watching. The older journalist cleared his throat and pushed forward. Mr. Vice President, let's not pretend this is a one-sided issue. The economy depends on migrant labor. Industries like agriculture, construction, and hospitality are desperate for workers. If you were to deport millions, who would fill those jobs? Vance exhaled through his nose. Predictable. Ah, he said, his voice carrying a razor-sharp edge of amusement. So, we've moved from calling this a humanitarian crisis to an economic necessity. Convenient. The journalist bristled. But let's talk about that, Vance continued. Because the American people are tired of hearing this lie. Who exactly benefits from unchecked illegal immigration? Big business, corporations that exploit cheap, off-the-books labor. Wealthy liberals who want cheap housekeepers and landscapers. Meanwhile, blue-collar American workers, black and Hispanic workers, see their wages stagnate or fall. You say these jobs have to be filled by illegal immigrants. Why? Because corporations refuse to pay a livable wage. That's an oversimplification, the journalist shot back, regaining some footing. The reality is, many Americans don't want these jobs. They're difficult, backbreaking, and don't pay well. Vance's smile was gone now. He leaned in. Have you ever worked a backbreaking job? He asked quietly. The journalist faltered for half a second. The answer was obvious. No, Vance continued before the man could stammer out an excuse. I have. I grew up in a steel town where people worked their hands raw to provide for their families. The people you dismiss as unwilling have been crushed by decades of policies that shipped jobs overseas and kept wages low by flooding the labor market with illegal competition. And now you sit here, comfortable in a DC studio, telling them they're too lazy to work? Do you hear yourselves? The silence that followed was suffocating. The young woman jumped in, trying to steer the conversation away from the economic argument. All right, let's talk about another consequence of your administration's policies: families seeking asylum. Under your tougher enforcement, many families are being turned away at the border. Are you comfortable knowing that some of these people, women and children, could end up in danger, even death? Vance's expression hardened. You know what I'm not comfortable with, he said. That in your attempt to guilt-trip Americans, you ignore who is responsible for their suffering. Do you know what the #1 killer of migrants crossing illegally is? The journalist blinked, unsure if it was a trick question. It's not the U.S. government, Vance interrupted. It's the cartels. The same cartels making billions off smuggling operations, sexual trafficking, and fentanyl. And you know what helps them? Your policies. My policies, she scoffed. The Biden administration. Your side of the aisle, Vance corrected, voice sharp as a blade. You oppose stronger border security. You fight every attempt to close asylum loopholes. You support sanctuary policies that let criminals disappear into cities like New York and San Francisco. The result? Cartels now advertise on social media that the border is open, making billions trafficking women and children into slavery. Tell me, how many migrant women get raped in the journey north? The woman stiffened. More than half, Vance answered for her. That's your humanitarian crisis. The room was deadly silent. The journalists had expected the standard talking points. They weren't ready for this level of direct confrontation. The younger journalist exhaled sharply. Let's say everything you're claiming is true. Oh, it is true, Vance cut in smoothly. Then what's your administration's plan? Because all we're seeing is an increase in border enforcement, but no real solutions to fix the root causes of migration. Vance sat back. Finally, a fair question. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. The answer is simple, he continued. Secure the border. Remove incentives. And go after the cartels directly. The older journalist frowned. Go after them how? Vance folded his hands together. Sanctions. Seizing cartel assets. Cracking down on the banks and businesses laundering their money. And if necessary, direct military action. The woman's eyes widened. Wait, you're suggesting military intervention in Mexico? Vance held her gaze. I'm suggesting we treat the cartels like the terrorist organizations they are. The tension in the room turned electric. You can't be serious, she said, almost breathless. That's an act of war. Vance's voice remained level. The cartels are already at war. With us, with Mexico, with the migrants you claim to care about. The only difference is, we've been pretending it isn't happening. A long silence stretched between them. The journalists were rattled. That much was clear. But they weren't beaten yet. And Vance knew the knockout blow was still coming. The silence in the studio was suffocating. J.D. Vance had thrown down the gauntlet, and the journalists weren't sure how to pick it up. For years, they had controlled the narrative, using emotional appeals and media spin to drown out dissent. But now, the Vice President of the United States sat across from them, dismantling their arguments one by one, not with slogans, but with hard, undeniable facts. And they were running out of ways to fight back. The younger journalist, still reeling from Vance's proposal to treat the cartels like terrorists, cleared her throat. So, Mr. Vice President, just so we're clear, you're advocating for military intervention in Mexico? Vance's gaze was unwavering. I'm advocating for America to defend itself. If the Mexican government refuses to deal with the cartels, then we will. The older journalist scoffed. That's a dangerous escalation. You can't just send troops into a sovereign nation. Like we did in Syria. Like we did in Iraq. Like we did in Afghanistan. Vance cut in. The difference is, those places weren't directly killing 100,000 Americans a year with fentanyl. Mexico is. The older journalist's lips pressed into a thin line. Vance could tell he was scrambling, looking for a way to reframe the conversation. And then he found it. All right, he said, sitting up straighter. Let's move beyond the border itself. Let's talk about the people who are already here. There are more than 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, many of whom have been here for years, contributing to their communities. Are you saying your administration intends to deport them all? There it was. The golden question. The moment where the audience at home would decide whether Vance was a heartless extremist or a pragmatic leader. Vance knew how to handle it. We're not going to let that number grow any larger, he said smoothly. First, we stop the flow. No more incentives. No more sanctuary cities. No more work permits for those here illegally. And yes, those who break our laws should be deported. The journalist pounced. Even dreamers? Even people brought here as children, through no fault of their own. Vance leaned in. Let me ask you something. If someone steals a car, then gives it to their child, does the child get to keep it? The journalist blinked. That's not a fair comparison. It's exactly the same, Vance said. Their parents broke the law. That doesn't make the child a bad person, but it also doesn't mean we have to pretend the crime never happened. But many dreamers don't even speak the language of their birth countries, the young woman countered. They know only America. You would uproot them from the only home they've ever known. Vance sighed. You always focus on the most sympathetic cases, but let's talk about the ones you don't mention. He pulled a paper from his jacket pocket and unfolded it on the desk in front of him. Here's a list of dreamers arrested in just the last 2 years for violent crimes, armed robbery, sexual assault, even murder. Do you really think every single dreamer is some innocent honor student? The young journalist's mouth opened, but no words came out. I'm not saying all of them are criminals, Vance continued, his voice measured. But your argument is dishonest. You act like we're deporting orphans in tears. The reality? Many of these so-called dreamers are in their 30s and 40s now. They've had decades to fix their status. Why haven't they? The older journalist jumped in. Because our immigration system is broken. It takes years to get citizenship. Vance's lips curled into a small smile. Oh, so now you admit the system is broken. And yet, every time we try to fix it, your side screams racism and blocks the reforms. Why is that? The journalist looked trapped. Let's be honest, Vance continued, his voice smooth but cutting. Your side doesn't want to fix immigration. You want amnesty. You want open borders. You want more low-wage workers who will vote Democrat for the next 50 years. That's the real game, isn't it? The journalist's face darkened. That's a conspiracy theory. Vance tilted his head. Is it? Then why is it that every time we talk about securing the border, Democrats call it cruel, but when they were in power, they funded border security without hesitation? Why is it that in private, they admit illegal immigration hurts wages, but in public, they pretend it's a humanitarian issue? The young woman's voice was tight with frustration. You're demonizing immigrants. You're making them sound like invaders. Vance's face darkened. Tell that to the parents of Laken Riley. The journalists went still. The room tensed. Laken Riley, the 22-year-old nursing student from Georgia, brutally murdered by an illegal immigrant. A case that had sent shockwaves through the country. Vance's voice was ice. She was out for a jog. In broad daylight. She never made it home. And why? Because her killer, a Venezuelan migrant, was caught illegally crossing the border twice and released. Because of policies you defend. The journalists shifted uncomfortably. Vance pressed on. How many more lives have to be lost before you admit the truth? How many more American families have to bury their children while you sit in these studios and lecture us about compassion? The older journalist's voice was quieter now. That was a tragedy, but you can't blame all illegal immigrants for one man's crime. Vance's eyes flashed. If an American citizen commits murder, he goes to prison. If an illegal immigrant commits murder, he gets deported and crosses back over the next month. Do you see the problem now? Neither journalist spoke. Vance sat back in his chair. He could feel the momentum shift, the weight of reality pressing down on the room. The young woman tried one last desperate angle. So what's your message to the millions of immigrants who come here seeking a better life? Vance didn't hesitate. My message: come legally. Respect our laws. Earn the right to be here. And don't expect America to break itself just to accommodate you. The older journalist exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. They were running out of options. They had one round left. And Vance knew exactly what was coming next. The final, desperate attack. The moment they'd throw everything they had at him. And he was ready. The journalists were out of ammunition. Their talking points had crumbled under Vance's relentless assault of facts. But they had one last move, the desperate, personal attack. The young journalist squared her shoulders. Mr. Vice President, critics say your harsh stance on immigration is rooted in racism. That your policies unfairly target people of color. How do you respond to that? Vance didn't flinch. He had been waiting for this. Ah, the race card, he said smoothly. You've lost the argument, so now you're calling me a racist. That's not what I said, she stammered. It's exactly what you meant, Vance shot back. And it's lazy. You call border security racist, but who suffers most from illegal immigration? Black and Hispanic workers. Who dies from cartel fentanyl? Americans of every race. And yet, every time we try to fix it, you scream racism instead of debating the facts. The older journalist tried to regain control. So you're saying race has nothing to do with immigration? I'm saying the only people obsessed with race are you, Vance replied. Americans, black, white, Hispanic, want the same thing. Safe communities, fair wages, and a government that enforces the law. You ignore them because the truth is inconvenient. Silence. Then, a slow nod from the older journalist. The young woman shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had lost. Vance leaned back. Any more questions? There weren't. The debate was over. And J.D. Vance had won.